Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe. Your support is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. I visited the house on a dare. The challenge was simple enough. Stay overnight in the historic Rosewood Mansion, the famed estate known for its dark history and whispered tales of hauntings. No one believed the rumors anymore. The house was just a dilapidated building, now a relic from a different time. The legends, though, were still alive, passed down from one generation to the next. Some said the mansion was cursed. Others claimed it was built over something unholy, which had caused misfortune and death to befall anyone who lived there. The mansion stood on the edge of town, shrouded by thick woods that added to its isolated, ominous air. It had been abandoned for decades, with vines creeping up the sides of the brick walls and broken windows gaping like dead eyes. My friends and I had been joking about it for weeks, laughing at the idea that anyone could actually believe in the stories. So when the dare was made, I took it up without hesitation. Spend one night in the Rosewood Mansion, record any strange happenings, and then leave. Simple. The front door was already partially open when I arrived, creaking as I pushed it the rest of the way. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of dust and decay. I pulled out my flashlight and surveyed the surroundings. The once grand staircase was now rickety and covered in dirt. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips, revealing the weathered wood beneath. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had turned gray with age. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for years. I set up my sleeping bag in what used to be the parlor. It was the most intact room in the mansion, with tall windows that allowed some moonlight to filter in. I spent the first few hours exploring the house. Most of the rooms were empty, their contents either taken by looters or simply lost to time. Every step I took echoed in the silence, the sound of creaking floorboards reminding me just how fragile the old structure was. The mansion was larger than I had imagined, with hallways that twisted and turned like a maze. The night crept on, and the house seemed to grow quieter, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. I set up my camera in the parlor and sat down in front of it, recording myself speaking into the darkness. I expected nothing to happen. For hours, it didn't. The only sounds were the occasional groans of the old wood settling and the distant rustling of the wind outside. But then something changed. It started with a subtle shift in the air. It felt colder, though there were no drafts that I could feel. The silence became heavier, more oppressive, like the house was closing in around me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After hours of being alone in the dark, I decided to go to sleep. But as I lay down, I heard a faint noise, like the sound of footsteps above me. I sat up, straining to hear, but the sound stopped. I stared at the ceiling, waiting, but the footsteps didn't return. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for the first time I felt a sliver of fear creep into my mind. I told myself it was just the house settling, the old wood groaning under its own weight. I managed to fall asleep, but it wasn't long before I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I jumped up, disoriented, and grabbed my flashlight. The noise had come from somewhere upstairs. My immediate instinct was to leave, but I forced myself to stay. I grabbed my camera and slowly made my way up the creaking staircase. Each step seemed louder than the last, echoing through the empty halls. When I reached the second floor, I swept my flashlight across the darkened hallway. The doors to the rooms were all closed, just as they had been earlier, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I heard another sound, a low, almost imperceptible whisper. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the sound down the hallway. It led me to the master bedroom, the largest room in the house. The door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn around, but I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, just as it had been when I first explored it, but something was different now. The air was colder, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but there was nothing there, at least nothing I could see. The whispering grew louder, though I couldn't make out the words. It felt like the walls themselves were speaking to me, telling me to leave. I turned to go, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of the room. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. My flashlight flickered, and the room seemed to darken, as if the shadows were closing in on me. Panic surged through me, and I bolted from the room, rushing down the stairs as fast as I could without falling. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air washing over me like a balm. I stood there, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I grabbed my things and left, not looking back as I drove away from the mansion. As I sped down the dark, winding road, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. Later, when I reviewed the footage from my camera, my blood ran cold. In the moments before I had left the master bedroom, the camera had caught something that I hadn't seen in person, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, watching me. The Rosewood Mansion still stands today, a decaying monument to the past. People still dare each other to spend the night there, but I'll never go back. Some places are haunted, not just by ghosts, but by the memories of the people who lived and died there. And some places, like the Rosewood Mansion, are best left undisturbed. Pine Ridge was a sleepy little town nestled in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing ever really happened. It was a town where people left their doors unlocked at night and waved at strangers passing through. But that all changed one autumn, when the nights grew longer and the air took on a chill that seemed to seep into your bones. I had just moved back to Pine Ridge after spending a few years in the city, trying to escape the hustle and bustle that never seemed to let up. My parents had passed away, leaving me the old family home on the outskirts of town, a place I hadn't visited in years. It was a big, creaky house, full of memories and the ghosts of the past. But it was home, and I needed a fresh start. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my days fixing up the old house, painting the walls, replacing broken windows, and cleaning out the clutter that had accumulated over the years. The nights were quiet, the only sounds being the occasional owl hooting in the distance and the wind rustling through the trees. But as October rolled in, things started to change. It began with the animals. People's pets started going missing. Cats, dogs, even livestock were disappearing without a trace. At first, everyone thought it was coyotes. They'd always been a problem in these parts, especially during the fall when food became scarce. But as more and more animals vanished, people began to whisper about something else, something darker. One evening, I was sitting on the porch enjoying a cup of coffee and watching the sunset when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the woods that bordered my property. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I stood up, peering into the gathering darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. I felt a surge of fear, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I wasn't one to scare easily, but there was something about that sound that set off every alarm in my body. I backed away from the porch railing, my eyes scanning the tree line, but whatever it was, it stayed hidden in the shadows. That night I barely slept, every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind keeping me on edge. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I found a set of footprints in the dirt near the edge of the woods. They were large, too large to be a coyote or even a wolf, and they looked almost human. But the toes were long and clawed, leaving deep gouges in the earth. I knelt down, tracing the outline of one of the prints with my finger, my heart racing. I didn't know what kind of animal made those tracks, but I was certain of one thing: it wasn't anything I'd ever encountered before. I decided to go into town, to talk to some of the locals and see if anyone else had noticed anything strange. When I mentioned the footprints, their faces grew pale, and they exchanged nervous glances. "You don't want to be talking about that around here," one of the old-timers said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Best to keep your head down and mind your own business." Another nodded in agreement, his eyes darting around as if he expected something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "There's things in these woods you don't want to mess with," he added, his voice trembling. "Best you just stay inside at night and lock your doors." Their words did little to ease my growing unease. In fact, they only made it worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on, that there was something they weren't telling me. But I didn't press the issue. If there was one thing I'd learned in my time away, it was that people in small towns had their secrets, and they didn't take kindly to outsiders poking around in them, even if I had grown up here. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences only escalated. More animals disappeared, and the growling in the woods became more frequent, more menacing. It was as if whatever was out there was getting bolder, more confident. I started keeping a shotgun by the door, loading it with the silver bullets my grandfather had left behind. He'd always been a superstitious man, muttering about things that went pop in the night and how silver was the only thing that could stop them. I laughed it off as the ramblings of an old man, but now I wasn't so sure. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something outside my window, a scraping sound like claws against glass. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest, and reached for the shotgun. I crept to the window, the cold metal of the gun heavy in my hands, and slowly pulled back the curtain. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring back at me from the darkness. They were set in a face that was more beast than man, covered in matted fur and twisted with rage. Its lips curled back, revealing a row of sharp, glistening teeth, and it let out a low, menacing growl. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the shotgun, and scrambled to my feet. The creature outside the window snarled, slamming its hand or paw. I couldn't tell which against the glass with a force that rattled the entire frame. I knew then that I couldn't stay here, that I had to get out before it found a way inside. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, my heart in my throat as I fumbled with the lock. I could hear it outside, scratching at the walls, circling the house, searching for a way in. Finally, I managed to get the door open and spent it to my truck, my hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, tearing out of the driveway and down the dirt road as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I saw it, a massive, hulking figure loping after me on all fours, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen, and it was gaining on me. I pressed down on the gas pedal, the truck's tires skidding on the loose gravel as I took a sharp turn onto the main road. The creature let out a furious howl, a sound that echoed through the night and sent a chill down my spine. But it didn't follow. I glanced in the mirror again and saw it standing in the middle of the road, watching me with those glowing eyes as I sped away. It wasn't until I reached the town limits that I finally let myself breathe, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest motel, where I spent the night huddled in a corner, the shotgun clutched in my hands. The next day I went back to the house, but it was different now. The windows were shattered, the door hanging off its hinges, and the walls were gouged with deep, claw-like marks. Whatever had attacked me, it hadn't been content to just scare me off. It had been trying to get in, to get to me. I didn't stay long. I packed up what little I had and left Pine Ridge for good, driving as far away as I could, until the mountains were just a distant memory in my rearview mirror. I never told anyone about what happened that night, about the creature I saw or the terror I felt. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear it, the growl that haunted my dreams, the eyes that stared into my soul, and I know deep down that it's still out there, waiting, watching, ready to strike again. For as I stood there, frozen in the middle of the path, those glowing eyes stared back at me, unblinking and eerily aware. The creature moved with a deliberate, almost unnatural grace, stepping out of the underbrush and into a small patch of moonlight that broke through the canopy above. The first thing that struck me was its sheer size. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall when it was on all fours. But what was more terrifying was when it rose onto its hind legs. The transformation from quadruped to biped was seamless, and as it straightened up, it seemed to gain even more height, towering over me at nearly 9 feet. Its fur was thick and dark, a deep black that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The creature's body was a twisted amalgamation of man and beast. Its torso was broad and powerful, resembling that of a heavily muscled man, but its limbs were elongated and tipped with wickedly sharp claws. Its head was unmistakably canine, with a long snout full of razor-sharp teeth that gleamed in the dim light. The teeth, some yellowed with age, were exposed as its lips curled back in a snarl. Saliva dripped from its mouth, landing with a soft hiss on the cold ground. Its ears were pointed and stood erect, twitching at every sound, giving it an air of hyper-awareness. But the eyes, those glowing eyes, were the worst. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were something far more intelligent, something that seemed to understand fear and reveled in it. They were a sickly yellow, burning with a malevolent light that made it clear this creature was more than just a beast. There was something profoundly wrong in those eyes, something that suggested a level of consciousness and intent that no animal should have the dogman move closer. Its breath visible in the cold air, each exhale a puff of mist that hung in the night before dissipating. The growl that rumbled from its chest was so low it was almost more felt than heard, a deep vibration that resonated through the ground and into my bones. As it moved, I noticed the way its muscles rippled under its fur, each step deliberate, powerful, and terrifyingly silent. Despite its massive size, I could smell it now, an overwhelming stench of wet fur, decay, and something else, something metallic, like blood. It was a smell that made my stomach turn, and my instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. My legs felt like lead, every fiber of my being locked in place by an all-consuming terror The creature stopped just a few feet from me, lowering its head as if to examine me. It sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it might pounce. My mind raced, trying to think of anything I could do to defend myself. But I knew there was nothing. I was utterly at its mercy. Then, with a movement so quick I almost didn't see it, the dogman swiped one of its massive claws through the air. The force of the blow knocked me off my feet, and I landed hard on the ground, a wind knocked out of me. Pain radiated through my body as I struggled to breathe, to move, but the creature didn't follow up with another attack. Instead, it simply stood there, watching me with those cold, calculating eyes. It was as if it was toying with me, enjoying my fear, savoring the moment. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, every beat a countdown to what I was certain would be my end. But the creature didn't strike again. Instead, it let out a low, rumbling growl, almost like a laugh, before turning and disappearing back into the woods with a fluidity that belied its size. I didn't dare move until I was sure it was gone. When I finally scrambled to my feet, I bolted from that spot, running faster than I ever had in my life. The only thing I could think of was getting away, putting as much distance between me and that thing as possible. Even now, I can still hear that growl in my nightmares, see those eyes staring at me from the darkness. The dogman wasn't just a story, not just a legend told to frighten children. It was real, and it was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next person foolish enough to cross its path. The decision to move back to my childhood home on Old Maple Road wasn't an easy one. After my father passed away, the house sat empty for months, its large windows staring blankly out at the overgrown yard. It was a grand old Victorian, the kind that people drive by just to admire, with its wraparound porch and towering spires. But it was also a house that had seen better days, its paint peeling and the roof sagging under the weight of too many seasons. I hadn't lived there since I was a kid, not since my mother's mysterious disappearance when I was 10. That event had cast a long shadow over our lives. My father had never talked about it, retreating into himself, and I had done my best to forget. But now, standing in front of the house, keys in hand, I wondered if the past was something you could ever truly escape. The first night back was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house creaked and groaned like an old ship, its wooden frame settling after years of neglect. The wind howled through the gaps in the windows, and the trees outside scratched against the walls like long-forgotten memories trying to break in. I told myself it was just the house adjusting to being lived in again, but there was a part of me that wasn't so sure. Over the next few days, I busied myself with cleaning and unpacking, trying to bring some life back into the old place. The more I worked, the more I felt a strange sense of unease. It was as if the house was watching me, waiting for something. At night I would hear footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate. But when I went to check, there was no one there. The air would grow thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe, and I would find myself shivering. Even though the furnace was on full blast, I started sleeping with the lights on. But even that didn't help. I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. But every time I turned on the light, the room would be empty, the shadows retreating to the corners where they belonged. One evening, as I was going through some old boxes in the attic, I found a diary that had belonged to my mother. I hadn't seen it in years, and the sight of it brought back a flood of memories. The cover was worn and faded, the pages yellowed with age. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure if I wanted to delve into the past, but Curiosity got the better of me, and I began to read. The entries started off normal enough, with my mother writing about everyday life, grocery lists, appointments, and the like. But as I read on, the tone began to change. She wrote about hearing strange noises at night, about feeling like she was being watched. She described how she would wake up in the middle of the night to find the bed sheets pulled back, as if someone had been sitting there, watching her sleep. The last entry was dated the night before she disappeared. In it, she wrote about a figure she had seen standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness. She wrote that she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the figure was there to take her away. She ended the entry by saying that if anything happened to her, she wanted me to know that she loved me, and that she was sorry she hadn't told me the truth sooner. I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. What truth? I flipped through the rest of the diary, but there were no more entries. Whatever my mother had meant to tell me, she had taken it to the grave. I closed the diary, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to think, but one thing was clear: the house on Old Maple Road wasn't just a house. It was something else, something dark and malevolent, something that had taken my mother and was now coming for me. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the diary clutched in my hands, my eyes fixed on the door. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew it was coming. The hours ticked by, and just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet along the floor. My heart leapt into my throat, and I sat up, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my door. I held my breath, praying that it would go away, but the door slowly creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was tall and shadowy, just like my mother had described. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. The figure took a step closer, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me, seeping into my bones. It reached out a hand, and I saw that it was not a hand at all, but a twisted, gnarled claw, its fingers long and bony. I finally found my voice and screamed, scrambling out of bed and running for the door. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air stinging my lungs. I could still feel its eyes on me, even though I knew it was inside, waiting. I drove to a friend's house, not stopping until I was safely inside, the doors locked and bolted. The next day, I went back to the house with a priest, hoping that he could do something, anything, to get rid of whatever was inside. But when we arrived, the house was empty. The air was still and silent, and there was no sign of the figure. The priest blessed the house, sprinkling holy water in every room, but I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever was in that house wasn't something that could be driven out by prayers or rituals. It was part of the house, part of the very walls and floors and ceilings, and it wasn't going anywhere. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I didn't care about the furniture, the memories, or even the diary. All I wanted was to be as far away from that house as possible. But even now, I can't escape it. The house on Old Maple Road haunts my dreams, its shadowy figure lurking in the corners, waiting, watching. And I know that one day it will come for me, just like it came for my mother. The weekend getaway to Hollow Creek was supposed to be a chance for my friends and me to unwind, a break from the city's chaos. The cabin was isolated, nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of nature. It was perfect tour, so we thought. The first night was peaceful, almost to quiet. We lit a fire, cooked dinner, and told stories late into the evening. The atmosphere was serene, the air crisp and cold, and the sky clear and full of stars. It was the kind of night that makes you forget about all your worries, wrapped in the comfort of good company and the warmth of a crackling fire. But as the night deepened, something changed. The air felt thicker, almost oppressive, and the sounds of the forest seemed to die out, replaced by a heavy silence that settled over us like a blanket. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of unease that none of us could quite shake, but it grew stronger as the hours passed. We all retired to our rooms around midnight, tired from the long day and ready to get some sleep. The cabin was small but cozy, with 2 bedrooms upstairs and a living area downstairs. I shared a room with my friend Mark, while the others paired off in the adjacent room. I was just drifting off when I heard a soft creaking sound coming from the hallway outside our door. It wasn't unusual for old cabins to make noises, but this was different. It was rhythmic, like the sound of footsteps moving slowly, deliberately. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wood settling, but the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. I turned to Mark, who was already wide awake, staring at the door with a look of confusion on his face. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the creaking. I nodded, my heart beginning to race. We both listened intently as the footsteps grew louder, moving down the hallway toward our door. They stopped right outside, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the doorknob rattled as if someone or something was trying to open it. Mark and I both shot out of bed, our adrenaline spiking. We stared at the door, waiting for it to swing open, but it never did. The doorknob stopped rattling, and the footsteps resumed, this time moving away from our room and back down the hallway. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples as I reached for the small lamp on the knit-stand, turning it on and flooding the room with light. Mark grabbed the baseball bat he always kept in his bag just in case, he'd said when we packed for the trip. We hesitated for a moment, listening, but the footsteps had stopped. "Should we check it out?" Mark asked, his voice tense. I didn't want to, but what choice did we have? We couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever it was to come back. I nodded, and we slowly opened the door, peering into the dark hallway. It was empty, just a narrow corridor leading to the staircase at the end. We stepped into the hallway, the wooden floorboards creaking under our weight, and made our way to the stairs. I could feel the cold air brushing against my skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of our room. There was no sign of anyone or anything having been there, but the oppressive feeling from earlier had returned, stronger now, almost suffocating. We crept downstairs, each step careful and deliberate, trying to make as little noise as possible. The living area was dark, the fire having long since burned out, leaving only the faint glow of embers. The front door was locked just as we'd left it, and the windows were all closed. Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do next. We checked every room, every corner, but found nothing out of place. It was as if the footsteps had been a figment of our imagination, a trick of the mind. But we both knew what we'd heard. We decided to wake the others, not wanting to take any chances. They were groggy and confused, but didn't argue when we told them what had happened. Together, we searched the entire cabin again, top to bottom, but found nothing. We kept the lights on, talking in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what had happened. But as the hours dragged on, we started to relax, convincing ourselves that it was just our imaginations, the product of tired minds, and an unfamiliar place. By dawn, we were exhausted, but the daylight brought a sense of relief. We laughed off the events of the night, attributing them to overactive imaginations and the eerie atmosphere of the isolated cabin. But as we packed up to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us, something that didn't want us there. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It stood there, silent and still, bathed in the early morning light. But I knew we weren't alone at night. Whatever had been in that cabin with us, it hadn't been human. And it was only by luck or perhaps something else that we'd made it out. None of us ever spoke about that night again, not even to each other. The memories of those footsteps, the feeling of being watched, were too unsettling to revisit. But every now and then, when I'm alone in a quiet room or walking through a dark hallway, I hear those footsteps again, faint and distant, reminding me of the uninvited guest we encountered at the cabin in Hollow Creek. I'd always been a nature enthusiast, the kind of person who finds solace in the quietude of the woods. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the scent of pine in the air, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot that makes the world seem a little less complicated. So when my friend Mike invited me on a weekend hiking trip to Pine Ridge Trail, I jumped at the opportunity. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a chance to disconnect from the hustle and bustle of city life and reconnect with nature. Little did I know it would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning, the sky a brilliant shade of blue, with just a few wisps of clouds drifting lazily overhead. The trail was beautiful, winding through dense forest and along the edge of steep cliffs that offered breathtaking views of the valley below. We made good time, chatting and laughing as we hiked, the weight of our packs hardly noticeable in the cool, fresh air. By midday, we reached a small clearing where we decided to stop for lunch. It was the perfect spot. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground, and a small stream trickled nearby, its gentle babbling providing a soothing soundtrack to our meal. As we sat there, enjoying our sandwiches and the serenity of the woods, I noticed something odd. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves just moments before, had grown eerily silent. It was as if all the animals had suddenly decided to hold their breath, waiting for something. I mentioned it to Mike, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a coincidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After lunch, we packed up our things and continued along the trail. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We planned to reach a campsite a few miles further up the trail before nightfall, but as we walked, that uneasy feeling from earlier grew stronger. The silence of the woods was unnerving, and I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I glanced over my shoulder several times, half expecting to see someone or something following us, but there was never anything there. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, we finally reached the campsite. It was a small, secluded spot surrounded by trees with just enough space for our 2 tents. We quickly set up camp and gathered some firewood, eager to get a fire going before it got too dark. The warmth of the fire was comforting, and we spent the next few hours talking and roasting marshmallows, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that hung in the air. It was some time after midnight when things took a turn for the worse. The fire had burned down to embers, and we were both starting to feel the effects of a long day of hiking. Mike was already snoring softly in his tent, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring up at the stars through the mesh of my tent, listening to the sounds of the night. At first, it was just the usual noises, crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, but then I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. It was a low, kettle growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the sound of any animal I was familiar with. It was deeper, more menacing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear where it was coming from. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I could tell whatever it was big, really big. I slowly reached for my flashlight, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My hand was shaking as I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I pointed it in the direction of the sound, but all I could see were trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I swung the flashlight around, and that's when I saw it. Standing just at the edge of the clearing was a massive, hulking figure. It was covered in dark, matted fur, its eyes glowing a deep, malevolent red in the beam of my flashlight. It was taller than any man, with broad shoulders and long, powerful limbs. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and animal, with a wide, flat nose and a mouth full of sharp, yellow teeth. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even scream. The creature stared at me for what felt like an eternity, its eyes boring into mine. Then, with a low growl, it turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with a speed and grace that belied its massive size. I don't know how long I sat there, my heart racing, staring into the darkness where the creature had been. Eventually, I managed to crawl out of my tent and wake Mike. He could see the terror in my eyes, and I quickly explained what I had seen. At first, he was skeptical, but the fear in my voice must have convinced him, because he agreed that we needed to leave. We quickly packed up our gear, not even bothering to extinguish the fire, and started back down the trail. The hike back to the car was the longest and most terrifying experience of my life. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hold some hidden threat. We moved as quickly as we could, but the darkness and the rough terrain slowed us down. Several times we heard the growl again, always somewhere behind us, but we never saw the creature again. It was as if it was toying with us, letting us know it was there, but staying just out of sight. When we finally reached the car, the first light of dawn was just starting to break over the horizon. We threw our gear into the trunk and sped out of there, not stopping until we were miles away. Even then, we didn't speak, both of us too shaken by what had happened. It wasn't until we were back in the safety of my apartment that we finally talked about it. Mike admitted that he had heard the growl too, and that he had seen something moving in the shadows, but he hadn't wanted to believe it. We both knew what we had encountered, though we never spoke the word aloud. We didn't need to. The fear in our eyes said it all. To this day, I don't go hiking alone, and I avoid Pine Ridge Trail like the plague. I still have nightmares about that night, about the creature that stalked us through the woods. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I do know one thing: it wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist, but does, and it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. We'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town knew about Shadow Pines Forest, the dense woodland that bordered our small, sleepy community. It was a place of legends where people claimed to have seen strange creatures, heard unexplainable sounds, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. But to us, it was just that, a bunch of stories told by bored locals to spook the newcomers. My friends and I were no exception. We never took the tales seriously. That was until the night we decided to venture into the forest ourselves. It was a typical Friday evening, and we were looking for something to do. The usual options movies, hanging out at the diner seemed to tame. So when Brian suggested we check out Shadow Pines, it didn't take much convincing. We were young, curious, and more than a little cocky. It seemed like the perfect way to prove the stories were just that stories. We set out just before dusk, the sky tinged with shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. There were 5 of us: Brian, his girlfriend Sarah, our friend Tony, my younger brother Ethan, and me. We packed flashlights, snacks, and a few bottles of water, fully intending to make a night of it. Our plan was simple: hike through the woods, find a spot to camp, and stay out until dawn, laughing in the face of the supposed horrors lurking in the shadows. The hike started out easy enough. The path into Shadow Pines was well trodden, at least at the entrance, and we joked and talked as we walked, the tall pines casting long shadows over us. But as the sun set and the forest grew darker, the mood shifted. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out what little light remained. The path became less defined, more overgrown, and the air grew colder, a sharp contrast to the warm evening we'd left behind. Still, we pressed on, determined to reach our chosen campsite deep within the forest. It was a spot Brian claimed to have found on a previous hike, a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, far from any roads or houses. A perfect place, he said, to experience the forest's true essence. But as we walked, the forest seemed to come alive around us. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees creak ominously. Strange noises echoed through the wood's soft rustlings, distant snaps of branches, and an occasional low growl that set shivers down my spine. We tried to ignore them, laughing nervously and making excuses. It's just a deer, probably a raccoon. But the unease was growing, gnawing at the edges of our confidence. By the time we reached the clearing, the night had fully set in, the darkness almost palpable. The moon, hidden behind thick clouds, offered little illumination, and our flashlights seemed weak against the oppressive blackness of the forest. We quickly set up our small camp, laying out sleeping bags and gathering some fallen branches for a fire. But the unease lingered, hanging over us like a shroud. We tried to shake it off, telling ghost stories around the flickering fire, the flames casting eerie shadows on the trees around us. But the stories felt forced, our laughter hollow. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified: the crackle of the fire, the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, and beneath it all, something else. A soft, almost inaudible sound, like the distant echo of footsteps, moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was Ethan who first noticed it. He went silent, his eyes fixed on the darkness just beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. We all fell silent, straining to listen. At first there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of the wind. But then we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. It was deep and primal, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Brian, ever the skeptic, tried to laugh it off. "Probably just a bear," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. We all knew that no bear made a sound like that. The growl came again, closer this time, and was followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush. Whatever it was big, and it was getting closer. Sarah gripped Brian's arm, her face pale in the firelight. Tony, who had been quietly poking at the fire with a stick, dropped it and stood up, his eyes wide with fear. "We should go," Tony said, his voice trembling. "Now," but it was too late. Before we could even stand, the creature emerged from the shadows, stepping into the edge of the firelight. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, tall, almost 7 feet, with a muscular, fur-covered body that looked both human and animal. Its face was grotesque, a twisted amalgamation of a wolf and a man, with sharp, pointed ears, a long snout, and glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce right through us. For a moment, none of us moved, frozen in terror as the creature stared at us, its lips curling back to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Then it let out a roar of sound so loud and ferocious it made my entire body shake. That was enough to snap us out of our paralysis. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him to his feet. We scrambled to our feet, abandoning our campsite and bolting into the forest. The creature gave chase, crashing through the trees behind us, its heavy footfalls echoing in the darkness. We ran blindly, the trees a blur as we tore through the underbrush, branches whipping against our faces. The creature was right behind us, its growls and snarls growing louder, closer. I could hear Sarah screaming, Brian shouting for us to keep running, but it all seemed distant, drowned out by the pounding of my heart and the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't know how long we ran, minutes, hours. It was all a blur, but eventually the sounds of the creature began to fade, and we slowed, gasping for breath, our bodies aching and exhausted. We had no idea where we were, the forest around us dark and unfamiliar, but the creature was gone, at least for the moment. We huddled together, trying to catch our breath, too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. The forest was silent again, the oppressive stillness settling over us like a shroud. I wanted to believe we were safe, that we had somehow outrun the creature, but deep down I knew it wasn't over. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to move. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch sent us into a panic, convinced the creature had found us, but it never showed itself again. As dawn broke, we finally dared to move, stumbling through the forest until we found the path that led back to town. We never spoke about what happened in Shadow Pines, not to each other, not to anyone. We left town soon after, each of us moving on with our lives, trying to forget the terror we'd experienced in that dark, cursed forest. But I could never forget. The memory of those glowing yellow eyes, that monstrous growl, haunted me for years. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, certain I could hear it again, the growl, the heavy footfalls, the creature stalking through the forest, hunting us. And I knew deep down that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows of Shadow Pines, waiting for its next victims. Late nights in Mumbai were nothing new for me. As a software engineer working for a multinational company, I often found myself leaving the office after the last train had departed, leaving me no choice but to hail a cab for the long ride home. The streets of Mumbai, usually teeming with life, take on an entirely different character in the early hours of the morning. The bustling crowds disappear, leaving behind an eerie silence that hangs in the air like a heavy fog. It was on one such night, as I stood on the deserted curb outside my office, that I experienced something I'll never forget. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I finally wrapped up my work and headed outside. The office building, normally a hive of activity, was now dark and silent, with only the distant hum of the city providing any sign of life. I pulled out my phone and requested a ride through a taxi app, relieved when a driver accepted my request almost immediately. The app showed that the taxi would arrive in about 5 minutes, so I settled in to wait, glancing around at the empty streets. True to the app's word, the taxi pulled up a few minutes later. It was an old, battered-looking vehicle, the kind you'd expect to see in the older parts of the city, not in the affluent business district. The driver, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a gaunt face, greeted me with a nod as I opened the door and slid into the back seat. I gave him my address, and, without a word, he started the engine and pulled away from the curb. At first, the ride was uneventful. The driver navigated the empty streets with practiced ease, weaving through the narrow lanes and taking shortcuts that only a seasoned local would know. I was tired, my mind still buzzing with the day's work, so I didn't pay much attention to my surroundings. Instead, I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes, hoping to catch a few minutes of rest before I got home. It wasn't long before I started to notice something odd. The usual sounds of the city honking horns, distant chatter, the hum of traffic seemed to fade away, replaced by an unsettling silence. I opened my eyes and glanced out the window, expecting to see the familiar streets of my neighborhood, but instead I found myself staring at an unfamiliar landscape. The buildings were old and dilapidated, their windows dark and empty, as if they hadn't been inhabited in years. The street lights flickered dimly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced eerily across the cracked pavement. I sat up straight, a sense of unease creeping over me. "Excuse me," I said to the driver, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet car. "Are we going the right way?" The driver didn't respond. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His expression was blank, almost as if he were in a trance. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was definitely not right. "Excuse me," I repeated, louder this time. "Where are we going again?" No response. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look at the driver's face, but the dim lighting in the car made it difficult to see clearly. That's when I noticed something else. There was no GPS running on the driver's phone, no navigation system guiding us to my destination. My heart started to race as I realized that I had no idea where we were or how to get back. I pulled out my own phone, intending to check my location, but to my horror, the screen remained dark, unresponsive. I tried pressing the power button, but nothing happened. It was as if the battery had suddenly died. Even though I had charged it fully before leaving the office, panic began to set in. I was trapped in a taxi with a driver who wasn't responding, and a part of the city I didn't recognize, with no way to call for help. "Stop the car," I shouted, my voice trembling with fear. "Let me out." The driver finally reacted. He turned his head slowly to look at me, and what I saw made my blood run cold. His eyes, which had been a normal brown when I first got into the taxi, were now a deep, unnatural black, as if they were bottomless pits. His skin had taken on a sickly, grayish hue, and his lips twisted into a cruel, knowing smile. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low and gravelly, a far cry from the normal tone he had used earlier. I scrambled for the door handle, desperately trying to get out, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, and no matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't open. The driver laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. The car picked up speed, the scenery outside becoming a blur as we raced down the deserted streets. I pounded on the windows, shouting for help, but the streets were empty, devoid of any signs of life. The buildings we passed were in various stages of decay, their walls crumbling and overgrown with weeds. It was as if we had been transported to a different world, one where the city had been abandoned and left to rot. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the car came to a sudden stop in front of an old, decrepit building. The driver turned off the engine and slowly turned to face me. His smile widened, revealing teeth that were far too sharp to be human. "We're here," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Before I could react, the car door unlocked with a loud click, and the door swung open on its own. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but the driver's gaze bored into me, leaving me with no choice. I bolted out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran towards the building. I didn't know why I was running towards it instead of away, but something compelled me to go inside. The building was just as decayed on the inside as it was on the outside. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The only light came from the faint glow of the street lights outside, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. I crept forward, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty hallway. As I moved deeper into the building, I heard the sound of whispers, low and unintelligible, as if coming from all around me. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. The further I went, the louder the whispers grew, until they were a cacophony of voices, filling my mind with dread. I stumbled upon a staircase leading down into what appeared to be a basement. The door at the top of the stairs was ajar, and through the gap I could see a faint light flickering below. Against my better judgment, I descended the stairs, drawn by the light, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, and sitting in that chair was a figure that I could only describe as a ghostly apparition. It was a woman, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. I stood frozen, unable to move, as the woman slowly raised her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were filled with a deep, haunting sadness, and when she spoke, her voice was a mere whisper, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice cracking with despair. "He won't let me go." Before I could respond, the whispers grew louder, and the room began to spin. The light flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my arm, pulling me back towards the staircase. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was dragged up the stairs and thrown out of the building, landing hard on the pavement outside. When I looked up, the taxi was gone. The street was empty, and the building I had just been inside was nothing more than a crumbling ruin, barely standing. I stumbled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached a main road where I finally flagged down another cab. This one was newer, the driver a young man, who looked at me with concern as I collapsed into the back seat. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine worrying. I nodded weakly, too shaken to speak. I gave him my address, and he drove me home without another word. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed, my mind reeling from the night's events. I never told anyone about what happened that night. Who would believe me? They'd say it was just a nightmare, a figment of my imagination. But I know what I saw, I know what I experienced, and I know that somewhere out there, in the dark corners of the city, that taxi is still roaming the streets, looking for its next victim. The cabin was old, worn with time, and buried deep in the forest where the trees grew so thick they almost blocked out the sun. I had inherited it from my uncle, a man I barely knew, and it had stood empty for years before I decided to visit. My friends thought it was a great idea, a weekend away from the city, surrounded by nothing but nature. I wasn't so sure, but I agreed. It seemed like a good chance to reconnect with the place and maybe even discover a bit about the man who had lived there before me. We set off on a Friday afternoon, my two closest friends, Mark and Leela, and me. The drive took longer than I expected, the roads becoming narrower and more treacherous the deeper we went into the forest. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked smaller than I remembered, the wooden exterior weathered and gray, the windows dark and lifeless. We unloaded our bags and made our way inside, the old wooden door creaking loudly as it swung open. The interior was just as I remembered, rustic, with mismatched furniture and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from the dying rays of the sun filtering through the dirty windows. We quickly set about making the place more comfortable, lighting a fire in the hearth and unpacking our supplies. Leela was in charge of the food, and soon the smell of frying bacon filled the cabin, mixing with the scent of wood smoke. Mark and I took care of the rest, making sure the old generator was still working so we'd have electricity for the weekend. As the evening wore on, we settled in, laughing and joking, the crackling fire and the warmth of the cabin making us feel more at ease. But even then there was something off. It was subtle, like a whisper at the edge of hearing, a feeling of being watched that I couldn't quite shake. I chalked it up to nerves, the unease of being in a place so isolated, so far from civilization. It wasn't until later, after dinner, when we were sitting around the fire, that the feeling grew stronger. Leela was telling a story about a camping trip she'd been on as a kid, when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence, her eyes fixed on the window behind me. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Mark asked, turning to look where she was staring. I followed their gaze, but there was nothing there, just the darkened window, reflecting the flickering firelight. "I thought I saw someone," Leela said, her voice trembling, standing outside, looking in. Mark and I exchanged a glance, but we didn't see anything. "Probably just your imagination," Mark said, trying to sound reassuring, but there was an edge to his voice that told me he wasn't entirely convinced. We tried to brush it off, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. The air seemed colder, the shadows deeper. I could feel the unease growing, creeping into the back of my mind like a slow-moving fog. We decided to call it a night, each of us retreating to our rooms in the back of the cabin. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes I felt like something was wrong, like there was someone or something in the room with me. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. It was then that I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps on the wooden floorboards just outside my door. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I wanted to get up, to open the door and see if someone was there, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, gripped by a fear I couldn't explain. The night dragged on, the minutes feeling like hours, until finally the first light of dawn crept through the window. I got up, my body stiff and sore from lying still for so long, and went to check on Mark and Leela. They were both already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, their faces pale and drawn. Neither of them had slept. They told me they'd heard the same sounds I had: footsteps, whispers, and the feeling of being watched. We decided to leave that morning, cutting our trip short. The cabin, which had seemed so welcoming in the daylight, now felt like a prison, suffocating us with its oppressive atmosphere. We packed up quickly, barely speaking, the tension between us thick as we loaded the car. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us, hiding in the shadows of the trees lining the narrow road. I glanced in the rearview mirror more times than I could count, half expecting to see something or someone lurking behind us. When we finally reached the edge of the forest, the sense of relief was overwhelming. We didn't talk about what happened that night, not to each other, not to anyone. But I couldn't forget. The memories of that weekend haunted me, the feeling of being watched, the soft sound of footsteps in the dead of night. I never went back to the cabin. I sold it a few months later to a couple looking for a quiet retreat in the woods. I didn't tell them about what we experienced, about the feeling that something unseen had been with us that night. I told myself it was just our imagination, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something in that cabin, something old and restless, something that didn't want us there, and I knew, no matter how far I went, I would never escape it. It was supposed to be an adventurous weekend, a break from the monotonous routine of city life. My friends and I had been planning the hiking trip for weeks. The Rocky Mountains were calling us, and we were more than eager to answer. We set out early on a Saturday morning, our backpacks stuffed with supplies and our spirits high. The plan was to hike up to a remote cabin that we had rented for the weekend, a place so isolated that it promised nothing but peace, quiet, and the beauty of untouched nature. The first day of hiking was everything we had hoped for. The weather was perfect, the sky clear, endless blue, and the trail wound through dense forests, along babbling streams, and up steep, rocky inclines. We took our time, stopping frequently to take in the breathtaking views, snap photos, and simply enjoy being away from the city. By the time we reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the landscape. The cabin was just as we had imagined it, a small, rustic structure made of weathered wood, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. There was no electricity, no running water, and no cell phone signal. It was perfect. We quickly settled in, unpacked our gear, and set about building a fire in the stone fireplace. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, cooking dinner, sharing stories, and enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. The first night passed without incident, but as the second day dawned, something began to change. The weather, which had been so perfect the day before, took a sudden turn for the worse. Dark clouds rolled in, and the temperature dropped, bringing with it a biting wind that howled through the trees. We decided to spend the day exploring the area around the cabin, but as we set out, an uneasy feeling began to settle over me. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than the changing weather, but as we hiked deeper into the forest, that feeling grew stronger. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming the day before, now felt oppressive, almost hostile. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out what little light managed to penetrate the thick clouds. The once cheerful sound of birdsong had been replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant crack of a branch. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a cold, wet blanket. I could tell that my friends were feeling it, too. The easy camaraderie of the day before had faded, replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. We pressed on, determined to make the most of our trip, but the further we went, the worse the feeling became. It was as if the forest itself was watching us, waiting for something. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, and the clouds had thickened, threatening rain. We decided to turn back, but as we retraced our steps, I realized that the forest seemed different, almost as if it had shifted while we weren't looking. The familiar landmarks we had passed on the way out were gone, replaced by unfamiliar trees and rocks. The trail, which had been so clear before, was now barely visible, overgrown with underbrush and tangled roots. Panic began to set in as we realized that we were lost. We tried to keep calm, telling ourselves that we just needed to backtrack a little further, but no matter which way we went, we couldn't find the trail. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing closer together, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it strange, unearthly sounds that sent chills down my spine. As the light began to fade, we knew we had to find shelter. We couldn't spend the night out in the open, not with the storm closing in. We decided to make our way back to the cabin, or at least to what we thought was the direction of the cabin. The going was slow, the underbrush thick and unforgiving. The wind whipped through the trees, sending leaves and debris flying through the air. The strange sounds grew louder, echoing through the forest, and every now and then I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, just at the edge of my vision. It was almost dark when we finally stumbled upon a clearing. At first I thought it was the same clearing where the cabin stood, but as we stepped into it, I realized that something was wrong. The cabin was there, but it wasn't the same. The wood was darker, almost black, and the roof was sagging, covered in moss and ivy. The windows, which I remembered as being clean and clear, were now cracked and dirty, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. We hesitated at the edge of the clearing, unsure of what to do. This wasn't the cabin we had left that morning. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, but there was no mistaking it. It was in the exact same spot as our cabin, surrounded by the same trees, with the same view of the mountains in the distance. Against our better judgment, we approached the cabin. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The inside was just as decrepit as the outside. The furniture was old and covered in dust, the fireplace cold and filled with ashes. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, but the worst part was the silence. It was as if the very air in the cabin was dead, heavy and oppressive. We huddled together, too afraid to venture back out into the forest, but also too scared to stay inside the cabin. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence: the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind, the distant drip of water. We tried to keep our spirits up, but it was clear that we were all terrified. As night fell, the storm finally hit. The wind howled outside, shaking the cabin to its very foundations. Rain pounded against the roof, and lightning flashed in the sky, illuminating the room in brief, stark bursts of light. But it wasn't the storm that scared us the most, it was the sense that we weren't alone. It started with the whispers, faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the storm. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. Then came the footsteps, soft but deliberate, as if someone or something was walking around the cabin. Just outside the door, we sat in the center of the room, our backs to each other, clutching our flashlights and trying to convince ourselves that it was just the wind, that our minds were playing tricks on us. But deep down, we knew the truth. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like they were right outside the door. We held our breath, too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. The door creaked, and for a moment, I was sure it was going to burst open. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The cabin fell silent once more, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. We didn't sleep that night. We sat huddled together, our eyes wide with fear, jumping at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, we cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The storm had passed, and the forest was calm, but the uneasy feeling remained. The cabin, which had looked so decrepit the night before, now appeared almost normal, but we knew better. Without a word, we packed up our things and left. We didn't stop to eat, didn't take any breaks. We just kept walking, determined to get as far away from that place as possible. It wasn't until we reached the main road, hours later, that we finally stopped to catch our breath. We never spoke about what happened that night, not to each other, not to anyone else. We all went our separate ways after that trip, the bond that had brought us together shattered by the experience. But I know that none of us will ever forget it. The memory of that night, of the whispers, the footsteps, the sense of being watched, haunts me to this day. And the worst part is, I know that cabin is still out there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting hikers to stumble upon it, waiting to draw them in, just like it did us, waiting to show them the horrors that lie within its walls. There's something about abandoned places that draws people in, a morbid curiosity to explore the remnants of a world left behind. For me, it was the old factory on the outskirts of town. It had stood there for decades, long after the last worker had clocked out, its towering smokestacks reaching into the sky like bony fingers. The place was a local legend, whispered about in hushed tones by those who claimed to have seen things they couldn't to explain. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or haunted places. To me, the stories were just that, stories, passed down and twisted with each retelling. So when a group of friends suggested we explore the factory one night, I didn't hesitate. It would be fun, I thought, an adrenaline rush, and nothing more. We set out just before midnight, a group of 5, armed with flashlights and the sense of invincibility that only comes with youth. The factory loomed in the darkness as we approached, its once bustling entrance now overgrown with weeds and vines. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, the silence around us broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Inside, the factory was a labyrinth of rusted machinery and crumbling walls. Our footsteps echoed off the cold concrete floors as we made our way through the darkened corridors. It was eerie, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. We laughed, joked, and dared each other to venture deeper into the heart of the building. But as we moved further in, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and the silence around us seemed to press in from all sides. It was as if the factory itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. We kept moving, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but I could feel the unease growing in the pit of my stomach. It started with the sound, a low, distant hum that seemed to come from deep within the walls. At first we thought it was the wind, but it didn't take long to realize that it was something else, something mechanical. We followed the sound, our curiosity piqued, until we reached a large, open room filled with rows of old machinery. The hum was louder here, almost like the factory was coming back to life. That's when we saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally so, its body shrouded in darkness. We froze, our flashlights trained on the figure, but it didn't move. For a moment, none of us dared to breathe, the silence between us stretching on and on. Then, slowly, the figure began to move, gliding across the floor with a fluid, almost unnatural grace. It didn't make a sound, its footsteps silent on the cold concrete. I felt a chill run down my spine as it came closer and closer, until it was standing right in front of us. But there was nothing there, just a patch of darkness, empty and cold. We turned and ran, our footsteps echoing in the empty factory as we fled. But no matter how fast we ran, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left us. It was as if the figure was still there, just out of sight, waiting for the moment to strike. We burst out of the factory, gasping for breath, and didn't stop running until we were back in town, the safety of street lights and civilization surrounding us. None of us spoke a word, the terror of what we had seen or what we hadn't seen still fresh in our minds. The factory was torn down a few years later, the land cleared for new development. But I never forgot what happened that night, the feeling of something old and malevolent lurking in the shadows of that abandoned place. I still drive by the site sometimes, a strip mall now standing where the factory once was. But every time I pass by, I can't shake the feeling that something is still there, watching, waiting for its chance to come back to life. It was just another long haul, or at least that's what I told myself when I hit the road that evening. I've been driving trucks for over 20 years, and I've seen all kinds of strange things out on the highways, animals darting across the road, bizarre weather, even the occasional unexplained light in the sky. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered on Route 66 that night. The job was straightforward: pick up a load of electronics in Los Angeles and deliver it to a warehouse in Chicago. The pay was decent, and I figured I could make the trip in 2 days if I pushed it. The first part of the journey was uneventful, just mile after mile of asphalt under my wheels, the hum of the engine, and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. I'd done this route countless times before, and I knew every turn, every rest stop, every diner along the way. As I left the lights of Albuquerque behind and headed east into the dark stretches of Route 66, I noticed that the highway was unusually empty. It was past midnight, but even then I expected to see a few other trucks or maybe some cars. But there was nothing, just me and the road. The sky was overcast, and there was no moon, no stars, just a thick blanket of darkness overhead. The only light came from my headlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating the worn, cracked pavement ahead. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of black and a sea of shadows. I turned on the radio, hoping for some music or even static, but all I got was silence. The only sound was the low rumble of the engine and the occasional creak of the truck as it rolled over the uneven road. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling myself it was just the late hour, the isolation, maybe even the fatigue setting in. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard at 13 a.m., the witching hour, as some folks like to call it. I chuckled to myself, trying to break the tension. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff, or at least I didn't want to. About 20 minutes later, I noticed something up ahead. At first, it was just a faint glow on the horizon, barely visible against the blackness. But as I got closer, the light grew brighter, and I could make out the shape of an old gas station on the side of the road. It looked like something straight out of the 1950s, with a rusty old sign that read Benny's Gas and Diner. I didn't remember seeing it on any of my previous trips, but then again, I usually didn't pay much attention to the roadside relics that dotted this stretch of Route 66. As I approached, I saw an old truck parked at one of the pumps, and a figure standing next to it. I slowed down, thinking maybe I could stop for a quick coffee or at least stretch my legs. But something about the scene didn't sit right with me. The truck was ancient, a beat-up old Ford that looked like it hadn't run in years. And the figure didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, as if it were waiting for something or someone. I felt a chill run down my spine as I passed by, and I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The figure was still there, standing motionless by the truck, its face hidden in the shadows. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the creepy feeling that had settled over me. It was just some old-timer out late, maybe the owner of the station. Nothing to worry about. But as I drove on, the unease only grew stronger. I found myself checking the mirror more frequently, half expecting to see that old truck following me. But the road behind me remained empty, just as it had been before. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. My heart raced as they drew closer, until they were practically right on my bumper. I couldn't see the vehicle behind me, just the blinding glare of the headlights in my mirrors. I wanted to pull over, let them pass, but the road was too narrow, with steep drop-offs on either side. There was nowhere to go. The headlights stayed on me for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they swerved into the oncoming lane and sped past me. I caught a glimpse of the vehicle as it shot by a black, old-fashioned car, the kind you'd see in a gangster movie from the 1930s. It was in pristine condition, not a scratch on it, the chrome gleaming in the light of my headlights. But it wasn't the car that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. It was the driver, or rather the lack of one. The car had no driver. The seat was empty, the steering wheel turning on its own as the car raced down the highway at breakneck speed. I watched in stunned silence as it disappeared into the darkness ahead, the taillights fading into the night. I slammed on the brakes, bringing my truck to a screeching halt in the middle of the road. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was no rational explanation. That car, that empty car, was real, and it had just passed me on a deserted stretch of Route 66. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to turn around, head back to the gas station, anything to get away from that road. But something deep inside me, some primal instinct, told me not to. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that if I turned back, I would never make it out alive. So I did the only thing I could. I kept driving. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, my scanning the darkness for any sign of that car, or anything else that might be lurking out there. But the road remained empty, just as it had been before. The unease never left me, though. It hung in the air like a dark cloud, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I don't know how long I drove like that, my body on autopilot, my mind in a state of numb terror. But eventually I saw the first faint light of dawn on the horizon. The darkness began to lift, the blackness slowly giving way to the soft grays and pinks of early morning. I could see the road clearly again, the outlines of the trees and hills, the familiar landmarks that told me I was nearing the state line. When I finally crossed into Oklahoma, I felt a surge of relief so powerful that it brought tears to my eyes. I pulled over at the first rest stop I came to, parked the truck, and got out. The cool morning air hit me like a splash of cold water, snapping me out of the daze I'd been in. I leaned against the side of the truck, my legs trembling, and tried to steady my breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring out at the empty highway, the memory of that night still fresh in my mind. Eventually, I got back in the truck and continued on to Chicago, but the rest of the trip passed in a blur. I didn't stop, didn't rest until I was parked safely at the warehouse, the load delivered, and the paperwork signed. I never spoke about what happened that night on Route 66, not to anyone. I didn't want people thinking I was crazy, or worse, that I was losing my grip after all these years on the road. But I know what I saw, and I know I'll never forget it. The image of that empty car racing down the highway will haunt me for the rest of my days, and I know one thing for sure: I'll never drive Route 66 at night again, because out there, on that lonely stretch of road, there's something waiting, something that shouldn't exist, something that defies explanation. And if you're unlucky enough to encounter it, you might not live to tell the tale. I'd always considered our neighborhood to be one of the safest places you could live. It was one of those quiet, suburban communities where everyone knew each other, and kids could play outside until dark without a second thought. Our house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by friendly neighbors and well-kept lawns. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. But that illusion was shattered one night when I came face to face with a nightmare I never expected. It was late on a Friday night, and my wife and I had just settled into bed. We'd had a long week and were both looking forward to a quiet weekend. The house was dark and still, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioner as it kept the summer heat at bay. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard a soft, metallic click, like the sound of a door being unlocked. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe I was still half asleep and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, louder this time, followed by the creak of hinges. My heart skipped a beat as I realized someone was in our house. I lay there for a moment, frozen with fear, trying to decide what to do. My wife was still asleep beside me, oblivious to the danger lurking just beyond our bedroom door. I knew I had to act quickly, but the thought of confronting an intruder filled me with dread. I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and reached for the baseball bat I kept in the corner of the room. My hands were shaking as I gripped the handle, my mind racing with thoughts of what I might find when I opened the door. I took a deep breath and slowly turned the knob, praying that I was wrong, that there was some other explanation for the noises I'd heard. But as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I knew I wasn't imagining things. The front door was wide open, and a figure was standing in the living room, their back to me as they riffled through our belongings. My blood ran cold as I watched them, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. I knew I had to do something, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The intruder was tall and broad-shouldered, their face hidden by the hood of a dark sweatshirt. I couldn't see any weapons, but that didn't mean they weren't armed. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house and call for help, but I couldn't leave my wife behind. I had to protect her, no matter the cost. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The intruder must have heard me, because they suddenly froze, their head tilting slightly as if listening. I tightened my grip on the bat, ready to swing if they turned around. But instead of facing me, they bolted for the door, moving so fast it was almost a blur. I chased after them, my adrenaline pumping as I reached the front door. But by the time I got outside, they were already gone, disappearing into the night. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the bat still in my hands, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The street was silent, the houses dark, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I'd come face to face with something terrifying, something that could have ended much worse. I went back inside, locking the door behind me and checking every room to make sure the intruder hadn't taken anything or left anything behind. My wife was still asleep, blissfully unaware of how close we'd come to disaster. I didn't wake her. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what had happened. Not yet. I needed time to process it myself. The next morning, I called the police and reported the break-in. They came and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, and no witnesses. It was as if the intruder had never been there at all, just a shadow that slipped in and out of our lives in the dead of night. But I knew better. I could still feel the terror that had gripped me when I saw that figure in our living room, the fear that had paralyzed me when I should have acted. And I knew that we weren't as safe as we'd always believed. The break-in had changed everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that they would come back, that this was only the beginning of something much worse. I installed security cameras around the house, added extra locks to the doors and windows, and even bought a gun for protection. But no matter what I did, I couldn't get rid of the fear that had taken root in my mind. The break-in had shattered my sense of security, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to get it back. Weeks went by, and the police never found any leads. Life slowly returned to normal, but I was always on edge, always waiting for something to happen. I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that I'd heard a noise, only to find that everything was quiet. The cameras never recorded anything out of the ordinary, and there were no more signs of an intruder. But the fear lingered, a constant presence in the back of my mind, and then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard the familiar click of the front door. My heart skipped a beat as I grabbed the bat and ran to the hallway, adrenaline surging through my veins. But when I got to the door, it was still locked, and the house was silent. I checked the cameras, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone outside. It was as if the noise had come from nowhere. That's when I realized that the break-in had done more than just steal our sense of safety. It had stolen my peace of mind. The intruder might be gone, but the fear they left behind was still very much alive. It haunted me, filling my nights with restless dreams and my days with constant anxiety. I'd come face to face with a nightmare, and I didn't know if I'd ever wake up. The moment I stepped through the heavy double doors of Ravenwood Hospital, I felt an unsettling chill in the air. It was my first day as a resident doctor, and the stories I had heard about this place echoed in the back of my mind. Colleagues spoke of unexplained phenomena, patients who disappeared without a trace, and a lingering sense of dread that clung to the walls. I had always dismissed such tales as mere superstition, a way for overworked staff to add some excitement to their monotonous routines. But as I began my first shift in the eerily quiet corridors of Ravenwood, I quickly realized that something was very wrong here. Not my initial assignments were routine enough, checking on patients, reviewing charts, administering medication. The hospital, though outdated, was still operational, but only just. Most of the wings were closed off, deemed unsafe or unnecessary due to a decline in the number of patients. Those who remained were either too sick to leave or had nowhere else to go. As I made my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hallways, dimly lit and echoing with the faint hum of fluorescent lights, seemed to stretch on forever, leading me deeper into the bowels of the hospital. It wasn't long before I encountered my first anomaly. I was attending to an elderly patient, Mrs. Green, who was bedridden and unresponsive. As I adjusted her for, I noticed a strange figure standing in the doorway, a man, dressed in an old-fashioned hospital gown, staring at me with hollow eyes. Startled, I turned to address him, but he vanished before I could speak. I rushed to the hallway, but it was empty, the only sound being the distant buzz of the nurse's station. I reported the incident to the charge nurse, who dismissed it with a weary smile. "You're not the first to see things around here," she said, her tone implying that this was just another part of working at Ravenwood. The hospital has a way of playing tricks on you, especially during the night shift. Just focus on your work, and you'll be fine. But I wasn't fine. The following nights brought more unsettling encounters. Patients spoke of voices calling their names from the darkness, shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their rooms, and a pervasive sense of fear that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. One patient, a young man who had been admitted after a car accident, became increasingly agitated, insisting that something was trying to take him away. He begged me not to leave him alone, his eyes wide with terror. One night, as I was charting in the deserted nurse's station, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the entire wing into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my flashlight, the silence around me suddenly oppressive. As the beam of light cut through the darkness, I saw them figures moving in the shadows, indistinct but unmistakably human. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and stumbled into an empty patient room. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the faint sound of whispering, growing louder and more frantic. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make sense of the voices, but the words were jumbled, incoherent, like a cacophony of tortured souls crying out for help. When the lights finally came back on, the figures were gone, but the terror remained. I knew then that Ravenwood was no ordinary hospital. There was something malevolent here, something that thrived on the fear and suffering of its patients and staff. I became obsessed with uncovering the truth, spending every spare moment researching the hospital's history. What I discovered only deepened my fear. Ravenwood had been built in the early 1900s, originally intended as a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients. Over the years, it had been repurposed several times, serving as a psychiatric hospital, a rehabilitation center, and finally a general hospital. But its past was marred by tragedy and timely deaths, suicides, and rumors of unethical experiments conducted on the patients. The records were incomplete, many of them mysteriously lost or destroyed, but what little I found painted a grim picture of suffering and despair. As my shifts continued, the hauntings became more personal. I began seeing the same figure, the man in the hospital gown, appearing in the same places, always watching me. He never spoke, never moved, just stood there, his hollow eyes fixed on me. I could feel his presence even when I couldn't see him, a cold, oppressive weight pressing down on me. The other doctors and nurses seemed oblivious to what was happening, or perhaps they were simply too frightened to acknowledge it. One night I found myself drawn to the old, abandoned wing of the hospital, a place that had been off limits for years. The door, which should have been locked, swung open easily, and I stepped inside, my flashlight casting long shadows on the crumbling walls. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was littered with debris, old medical equipment, broken furniture, and tattered patient files. As I ventured deeper into the darkness, I felt a growing sense of dread, as if I was being led to something terrible. At the end of the hallway, I found a room that had been sealed off, the door covered in rust and grime. With trembling hands, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, with a single bed and a cracked window that let in a sliver of moonlight. But it was the figure standing by the bed that made my blood run cold. The man in the hospital gown, his hollow eyes staring directly at me. He raised a hand, pointing to something on the bed. I forced myself to look and saw an old, yellowed patient file lying there, the name on it barely legible. I picked up the file and opened it, my hands shaking. The details were horrific. A patient who had been subjected to cruel and inhumane treatments, left to die alone in this very room. The file had been deliberately hidden, the patient's existence erased from the hospital's records, but now his spirit was trapped here, unable to move on, his suffering and anger fueling the darkness that permeated Ravenwood. I fled the room, the file clutched in my hand, and never looked back. The next day I submitted my resignation, unable to continue working in a place so consumed by evil. I tried to tell others about what I had experienced, but most dismissed it as stress or an overactive imagination. But I knew the truth. Ravenwood Hospital was haunted by the lost souls of those who had been mistreated and forgotten, their pain echoing through the halls. I never returned to Ravenwood, but the nightmares have never left me. I still see the man in the hospital gown, standing at the foot of my bed, his hollow eyes a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks in the shadows. I can only hope that one day those trapped souls will find peace, and that Ravenwood will finally be laid to rest. It was supposed to be just another quiet night in the woods. My buddies and I had decided to take a weekend camping trip to unwind from the stress of work and life. We'd been going to the same spot for years, a secluded clearing deep in the national forest, far from any signs of civilization. It was our escape, our little slice of paradise, where we could leave our worries behind and just enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. But this trip would be different. This trip would be the one we'd never forget. We arrived at the campsite just before sunset, the sky ablaze with shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp and cool, the scent of pine and earth filling our lungs as we set up our tents and gathered firewood. We'd packed enough supplies to last us the weekend: food, beer, and more than enough firewood to keep us warm through the chilly nights. Everything seemed perfect, just like it always did. As darkness fell, we lit the campfire and settled in for a night of storytelling and laughter. The flames danced in the fire pit, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. We were miles away from the nearest town, with no cell service and no one around for miles. It was just us and the wilderness, the way we liked it. We were about an hour into our evening when we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from somewhere in the trees. It was so faint at first that we weren't sure if we'd really heard it, but then it came again, louder this time, sending a shiver down my spine. "Did you hear that, Jake?" one of my friends asked, his voice tinged with unease. "Probably just a coyote," I replied, trying to brush it off. But deep down I knew it didn't sound like any coyote I'd ever heard. The growl came again, this time closer, and we all fell silent, straining to listen. The forest around us was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves completely absent. It was as if the entire woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And then we heard it howl, long and mournful, echoing through the trees. But it wasn't the howl of a wolf or a coyote. It was deeper, more menacing, like the cry of something not quite human. My heart began to race as I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. What the hell was that? Tom, another one of my buddies, whispered, his face pale in the firelight. "I don't know," I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. But I could feel the fear creeping in. This was something different, something we'd never encountered before. The howl came again, this time closer, and I could hear the sound of something moving through the underbrush, heavy footsteps crunching on leaves and snapping twigs. It was coming toward us. Panic began to set in as we scrambled to our feet, grabbing whatever we could to defend ourselves: knives, sticks, anything. We'd always joked about being prepared for a bear attack, but this didn't feel like a bear. This felt like something else, something much worse. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right on the edge of our campsite. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees. And then we saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of the flames. It was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders and long, muscular limbs. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the firelight like a predator's. For a moment, none of us could move. We were frozen in place, staring at the creature that was staring back at us. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, a grotesque mix of man and beast, covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was elongated, almost like a wolf's, but with an intelligence in its eyes that sent a chill down my spine. The creature let out another howl, so loud and piercing that it felt like it was vibrating in my chest. That was all it took to snap us out of our stupor. We turned and ran, abandoning our campsite and everything we'd brought with us. The only thing that mattered was getting away from whatever that thing was. We sprinted through the woods, the creature's howls echoing behind us, spurring us on. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear the heavy footsteps chasing us, growing closer and closer with each passing second. We didn't stop until we reached the road where we'd parked our trucks. We piled in, slammed the doors, and sped off, not daring to look back. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The others were silent, their faces pale and drawn, as if they'd seen a ghost. We drove for miles without saying a word, too terrified to even speak. It wasn't until we reached the safety of a small town that we finally pulled over. We sat there in the parking lot of a gas station, trying to catch our breath and make sense of what had just happened. "What the hell was that thing?" Jake finally asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I reply, still shaking. But it wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. We spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel, too scared to go back into the woods. None of us could sleep. The image of that creature burned into our minds. We kept the lights on, jumping at every sound, afraid that it might somehow find us. The next morning, we returned to the campsite to gather our things. The place was eerily quiet, the remnants of our campfire cold and dead. There were no signs of the creature, no tracks, no evidence that it had ever been there. But we knew what we'd seen, and we knew we'd never forget it. We never went back to that spot again. In fact, we stopped camping altogether after that. The woods, which had once been our sanctuary, now felt like a place of danger, a place where something dark and terrifying lurked just beyond the trees. I still think about that night sometimes, the night we heard the howl and came face to face with something out of a nightmare. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I do know one thing: I'll never forget the fear that gripped me when I saw those glowing eyes in the darkness, or the sound of those heavy footsteps chasing us through the woods. It was the night we realized that there are things out there in the wild that we can't explain, things that defy reason and logic. And it was the night that changed everything. The soft glow of my phone screen illuminated my face as I swiped left, right, each motion becoming increasingly mindless. I'd been on Tinder for a few months, mostly out of boredom, hoping to find someone interesting to break up the monotony of my life. Living in a small town made it difficult to meet new people, and the dating pool was limited. But tonight I matched with someone who caught my eye. His name was Michael, and his profile was unlike the others. No shirtless selfies, no cringeworthy pickup lines, just a genuine smile and a few pictures of him hiking and camping. We started chatting, and our conversation flowed naturally. He was funny, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. After a few days of texting, he suggested we meet up for dinner. I was hesitant at first. Meeting someone from a dating app always carried a certain risk, but something about him made me feel at ease. We agreed to meet at a cozy little restaurant on the outskirts of town, a place I had been to a few times and knew well. The day of our date, I was a bundle of nerves and excitement. I spent extra time getting ready, choosing an outfit that was both casual and flattering. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I couldn't help but feel a surge of optimism. Maybe this would be the start of something special. When I arrived at the restaurant, Michael was already there, sitting at a corner table. He looked just like his pictures, tall, athletic, with an easy smile that put me at ease. We exchanged pleasantries, and I sat down across from him, my nerves slowly melting away as we chatted over dinner. The conversation was lively, filled with laughter and shared stories. Michael had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, his attention focused solely on me. The night seemed perfect, almost too good to be true. After dinner, Michael suggested we go for a walk. The night was cool, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and earth. We strolled through the nearby park, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. As we walked, the conversation took a more personal turn. Michael opened up about his childhood, his dreams, and his struggles. There was a vulnerability in his words that drew me in, made me feel connected to him in a way I hadn't felt with anyone in a long time. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something off about Michael. His stories began to contradict each other, small details that didn't quite add up. When I mentioned it, he brushed it off with a laugh, saying I must have misheard him. I wanted to believe him, but a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me something wasn't right. As we reached the end of the park, Michael suggested we take a shortcut through the woods to get back to our cars. The path was dark, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to say no, but Michael assured me it was safe. I've walked this path 100 times, he said, flashing me that easy smile. Trust me. Against my better judgment, I agreed, and we ventured into the woods. The darkness swallowed us, the faint light from the moon barely penetrating the thick canopy of trees. As we walked, the conversation grew quieter, the silence between us stretching into an uncomfortable tension. My heart began to race, every nerve in my body on high alert. Suddenly, Michael stopped walking. I turned to look at him, and the smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating expression I hadn't seen before. "I've been waiting for this," he said, his voice low and menacing. Panic surged through me as I realized I was alone in the woods with a man I barely knew, and everything about this situation was wrong. I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us, but he grabbed my arm, his grip tight and unyielding. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, pulling me closer. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but all I could think about was how stupid I'd been to trust him, to let my guard down. I struggled against him, trying to break free, but he was too strong. The woods around us were silent, the trees closing in like a trap. I felt utterly helpless, fear coursing through my veins like ice. Just as I was about to scream, I heard a rustling in the bushes behind us. Michael froze, his grip loosening slightly as he turned to look. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged, a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, carrying a large hunting knife. My blood ran cold as I realized this wasn't some random hiker who had stumbled upon us. Michael's reaction told me everything I needed to know. They knew each other. "Finally caught one, did you?" The man sneered, his voice rough and mocking. Michael didn't respond, his expression tense as he looked between me and the newcomer. This was planned. I was never supposed to make it out of these woods. The man took a step closer, his knife gleaming in the faint light. "Let her go," he said, his tone more menacing than before. Michael's grip on my arm tightened again, but I could feel him wavering. There was something in the other man's eyes that scared him, something more dangerous than I could comprehend. Seizing the opportunity, I wrenched my arm free and bolted into the trees. I didn't look back, didn't care about the noise I was making as I crashed through the underbrush. All I could think about was getting away, putting as much distance between me and those two men as possible. The woods were a blur as I ran, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps heavy and fast, closing the distance. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw lights in the distance, headlights. Faint but unmistakable. I pushed myself harder, bursting out of the trees and onto a road. A car was coming towards me, and I threw myself in front of it. Waving my arms frantically, the car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed on the pavement, gasping for breath. The driver, an older woman, jumped out and ran to my side, her face a mask of concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. I couldn't speak, my mind still reeling from what I'd just escaped. I looked back at the woods, expecting to see Michael and the other man emerging from the trees, but they were gone. The darkness had swallowed them up, leaving only silence in their wake. The woman helped me into her car and drove me to the nearest police station. I told them everything, every detail I could remember, but when they searched the woods, they found nothing, no sign of Michael, no trace of the other man. It was as if they had never existed. The experience left me shaken, a lingering fear that haunted my every waking moment. I deleted the Tinder app the next day and swore off online dating for good. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there somewhere, waiting for their next victim. It was the middle of a long, sweltering summer, the kind where the air feels thick with humidity, and the nights seem to stretch on endlessly. I was living alone in a small old house at the edge of town. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it had its charm, a little garden out front, a creaky porch swing, and an attic full of forgotten treasures left behind by the previous owners. I'd only moved in a few months prior, drawn by the quiet and the cheap rent. Little did I know, the peace I sought would soon be shattered in the most terrifying way imaginable. It started innocently enough, with little things that were easy to dismiss. At first, it was just the odd creak of the floorboards at night, or the occasional draft that made the curtains flutter when the windows were closed. I didn't think much of it. Old houses make noises, and I figure it was just settling. But then the noises started getting louder, more distinct. Footsteps in the hallway, the sound of something scraping against the walls, and sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard whispering. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I'd be sitting on the couch, reading or watching TV, and I'd feel eyes on me, like someone was standing just out of sight, staring at the back of my head. I'd turn around, expecting to see someone there, but of course the room was always empty. It was unsettling, but I didn't think I had any real reason to be scared. That is, until the night I came home to find the front door wide open. I'd been out running errands, and when I pulled into the driveway, I saw the door swinging on its hinges, the faint light from the hallway spilling out into the night. My heart skipped a beat as I parked the car and cautiously approached the house. Had I forgotten to lock the door? I was sure I had, living alone. I was always careful about things like that. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something else. The window beside the door was broken, the glass shattered and scattered across the floor. Panic surged through me. Someone had been here. Someone had broken into my house. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to go inside or call the police. But curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly pushed the door open, stepping into the dark hallway. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making every little noise seem deafening. I reached for the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out. My heart was racing as I moved further into the house, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. I checked the living room, the kitchen, everything was untouched, just as I'd left it. But as I made my way down the hallway toward the bedroom, I noticed something strange. The air was colder here, and there was a faint smell of something musty, like damp earth. I pushed open the bedroom door, and that's when I saw it. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the breeze. My bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled as if someone had been lying there. But what really made my blood run cold was the sight of muddy footprints on the floor, leading from the window to the closet. I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind racing. Someone had been in my house, in my room, possibly even in my bed. And whoever it was, they were still here, hiding in the closet. I wanted to run, to get out of the house as fast as I could, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my eyes locked on the closet door. Then, slowly, the door began to creak open. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was running down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst out the front door, not bothering to close it behind me, and ran to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition, but somehow I managed, and I peeled out of the driveway. Speeding away from the house, I drove straight to the police station, my mind racing with 100 different thoughts. What had I seen? Who had been in my house? And why hadn't they tried to stop me when I ran? The officers took my report, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to my nerves, suggested I might have imagined the whole thing in the dark. But they agreed to send a patrol car to check the house, just in case. I waited at the station, my heart still pounding in my chest, until the officers returned. They told me they'd found the house empty, no signs of forced entry, and no muddy footprints. The window had been closed and locked, and everything was in its place. It was as if nothing had happened, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew there had been someone in that closet, someone who had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. The thought of going back to that house made my skin crawl, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. So I reluctantly returned, trying to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. The next few nights were a blur of sleeplessness and anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was still there, lurking in the shadows. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains sent my heart racing. I started keeping a knife by my bed just in case. Then, one night I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My blood ran cold as I realized the noise was coming closer, getting louder. I reached for the knife, my hands trembling as I gripped the handle. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. Then, slowly, the door began to open. I didn't wait to see who or what was behind it. I bolted out of bed and ran for the window, throwing it open and scrambling out onto the roof. I didn't care about the fall or the possibility of injury. I just needed to get out of that house. I jumped, landing hard on the ground below, and took off running down the street. I never went back to that house. I packed up what little I could carry and moved in with a friend across town. I didn't even bother telling the police this time. I knew they wouldn't believe me, but I knew the truth. There was something in that house, something that had been watching me, stalking me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. To this day, I still have nightmares about that place. I can't explain what happened or why, but I know one thing for sure: whatever was in that house, it wasn't human, and it wasn't finished with me. Driving a taxi at night isn't for everyone. The long hours, the solitude, and the unpredictable passengers can wear on a person. But for me, it was a way to pay the bills and keep my family fed. I'd been driving for nearly 10 years, and in that time, I'd seen my fair share of odd things. Drunk passengers who could barely stay awake, couples arguing so fiercely that I thought they'd come to blows, and once, even a celebrity who just wanted to escape the paparazzi. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was late, around 2 a.m., and the streets were quiet. Most of the city was asleep, and those who weren't were either tucked away in bars or heading home to do just that. I had just dropped off a fare in a residential area and was considering calling it tonight when my dispatch radio crackled to life. A fare had been requested at a location not too far from where I was. I figured I could squeeze in one more ride before heading home, so I accepted the job and headed in that direction. The address was in a part of town I wasn't too familiar with, a more rural area on the outskirts where the city's lights gave way to open fields and dense woods. As I drove, the houses became fewer and farther between until they disappeared entirely, leaving just the dark road ahead of me. I checked the address again, thinking I might have made a wrong turn, but according to the map, I was on the right path. Finally, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a long, flowing dress that looked almost old-fashioned. Her hair was dark and hung loose around her shoulders, and she stood perfectly still as I approached. I slowed the car and rolled down the window to ask if she was the one who called for a taxi, but she just opened the door and got in without a word. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She didn't respond, just stared straight ahead with an expression that was both vacant and intense. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shook it off, figuring she might be tired or upset about something. "All right," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Just let me know when we're getting close." I pulled back onto the road and continued driving. The silence in the car was oppressive, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror more than usual, trying to get a read on this strange passenger. Her eyes never left the road ahead, and she didn't so much as blink. The further we drove, the more uneasy I became. The road was getting narrower, the trees on either side closing in like a tunnel. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like miles, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. After what seemed like an eternity, the woman finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and I had to strain to hear her over the hum of the engine. "Turn left up ahead," she said. I hadn't noticed any turns coming up, but sure enough, there was a narrow dirt road veering off to the left, barely visible in the dark. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to follow her directions. The road was rough, full of potholes, and lined with overgrown bushes that scraped against the sides of the car. We drove for another few minutes before she spoke again. "Stop here," she said. I brought the car to a halt and looked around. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick trees and complete darkness. There was no sign of a house, a driveway, or anything that would indicate we were at someone's destination. "Are you sure this is the right place?" I asked, my voice betraying the unease I felt. She didn't answer, just opened the door and stepped out of the car. I watched as she walked a few steps forward and then turned to face me. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying an odd, echoing quality that sent another chill down my spine. Before I could respond, she turned and started walking into the woods. I sat there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. It wasn't my place to follow her, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. Against my better judgment, I called out to her, "Wait, do you need help? It's not safe out here." She didn't stop or even acknowledge that she'd heard me. She just kept walking, disappearing into the trees as if she'd never been there at all. I sat there for a moment longer, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. Then, without another thought, I put the car in reverse and backed out of that dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, the lights of the city far off in the distance. I was about to call it a night when my phone rang. It was dispatch, asking if I'd picked up the fare. I hesitated, then told them I had, but that the passenger had gotten out before reaching their destination. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the dispatcher spoke again. "Are you sure? We just got a call from someone at that address asking where their ride is." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? I just dropped someone off there." Another pause, longer this time. "That address you went to ... No one lives there. It's an old, abandoned house, been empty for years." I hung up the phone without saying another word, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't drive home. At night I couldn't. Instead I parked in a well-lit lot and sat there until the sun came up, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day I tried to forget about it, to convince myself that it had all been some weird, creepy misunderstanding. But when I checked the back seat of my car, I found a damp, muddy footprint on the floor mat. A single footprint, small and delicate, like that of a woman who had walked barefoot through the woods. I never drove out to that part of town again. In fact, I avoided picking up fares after dark whenever I could. The memory of that night, of that woman who seemed to vanish into thin air, stayed with me, and even now, years later, I sometimes think about her. Who was she? What happened to her? And why did she choose me to be the one to give her that final ride? It was supposed to be just another weekend camping trip, an escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. I needed a break, something to clear my mind, so I decided to head out to a remote area, the woods, a place I'd visited a few times before. It was deep enough into the forest to be isolated, but not so far that I couldn't hike back to civilization if necessary. I packed lighted tent, some food, my trusty knife, and a few other essentials. I had no idea that this trip would change everything. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The air was cool, crisp, with that earthy scent of pine and moss that always made me feel at peace. I hoisted my backpack and started down the narrow trail, the familiar crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the distant call of a bird. I felt at ease, like I was returning to a place that had always welcomed me. After about an hour of hiking, I reached my favorite spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a little stream running nearby. I set up camp, pitching my tent and gathering some firewood. As dusk settled in, I got a fire going, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. I sat back, enjoying the warmth and the solitude. This was exactly what I needed. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to creep over me. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense of unease, like something was off. The woods seemed quieter than usual, the night air heavier. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the feeling persisted. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I decided to turn in early, hoping that sleep would calm my nerves. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped up the flap. The night was cold, but I bundled up in my sleeping bag and tried to relax. The sounds of the forest crickets, the gentle rustle of leaves slowly lulled me into a light sleep. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. Thought it was a low, guttural growl, deep and menacing, coming from just outside my tent. My eyes flew open, and I lay there, frozen, listening. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the brush. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear, every muscle in my body tense with fear. I reached for my knife, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle. I had no idea what was out there, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever encountered in these woods. The growling continued, closer now, circling the tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snapping of twigs, as whatever it was prowled around me ducked. And then, suddenly, the growling stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I held my breath, waiting, my heart thudding in my ears. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, it had gone away. But then the tent began to shake. It was a violent, frenzied motion, like something was trying to tear its way inside. I could hear claws scraping against the fabric, a low, rumbling snarl that sent a shiver down my spine. I gripped the knife tighter, ready to defend myself. But I knew I was no match for whatever was out there. The tent walls bulged inward as the creature pushed against it, its breath hot and rancid, seeping through the thin material. I could make out the shape of its head, large and angular, with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the attack stopped. The tent fell still, the growling faded, and I was left in the oppressive silence of the night. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, for fear of drawing its attention again. I lay there, knife in hand, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Hours passed before I finally mustered the courage to unzip the tent and peer outside. The forest was still, bathed in the dim light of the waning moon. There was no sign of the creature, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anything had been there at all. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. It wasn't a dream, wasn't a trick of the mind. Something had been out there, something real, and it had wanted to get to me. I packed up camp as quickly as I could, my hands shaking, and started the long hike back to the trailhead. Every step was torture, my senses on high alert, expecting the creature to return at any moment. But the woods remained eerily quiet, as if the forest itself had witnessed what had happened and was holding its breath. When I finally made it back to my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I drove back to town, the events of the night replaying over and over in my mind. What had I encountered in those woods? What kind of creature could have been so strong, so terrifying? The stories I had heard about the dogman came rushing back to me, tales of a half-man, half-beast that stalked the forest, hunting anyone who dared to venture into its territory. I never went back to those woods. I couldn't. Not after what had happened. The fear, the terror, was too real, too raw. I moved to a new town, far away from the forest and tried to put the experience behind me. But the nightmares still come, the memories still haunt me. I can still hear that growl, that menacing, guttural sound that I'll never forget. Whatever it was, whatever creature lurks in those woods, I know one thing for sure: it's still out there, waiting, watching. And if you ever find yourself deep in the forest, alone at night, you'd better pray that it doesn't find you. The night was supposed to be an ordinary one, just another evening spent with my friends around a campfire deep in the woods. We were college students looking to escape the pressures of school and life, and the woods had always been our refuge. There was something comforting about being surrounded by the towering trees, the crackling fire, and the chorus of crickets. We'd done this a dozen times before, and nothing unusual had ever happened. But that night was different. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, her brother Matt, and our mutual friend Lily. We'd driven out to a spot we knew well, a clearing deep in the forest where we could camp without being disturbed. The air was cool, and the sky was clear, with the stars shining brightly overhead. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and soon had a roaring fire going. As the night wore on, we talked, laughed, and roasted marshmallows. The conversation eventually turned to local legends and ghost stories, as it always did when we were out in the woods. Matt, always the skeptic, scoffed at the idea of anything supernatural. "It's all just stories," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "People let their imaginations get the better of them." Jake, however, was more open to the idea. He'd grown up hearing tales of the skinwalkers, shapeshifters who could take on the form of any animal or person. "My grandmother used to tell me about them," he said, his voice low and serious. "She said they were real, that they were people who had been cursed, forced to wander the earth as something not quite human." Lily shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "That's creepy," she said, "but you don't really believe in them, do you?" Jake shrugged. "I don't know, but I've heard stories. People who've seen things out here in the woods that they can't explain. Strange noises, animals behaving weirdly, shadows that don't belong." Matt rolled his eyes. "Please, it's just your mind playing tricks on you. There's nothing out here but us and some deer." He stood up, stretching. "I'm going to take a leak." "Don't let the skinwalkers get me while I'm gone," he said with a smirk, heading off into the darkness. We watched him go, his flashlight bouncing as he walked away from the fire. The mood around the campfire grew tense as we waited for him to return. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the usual sounds of the night fading away. I glanced at Jake, who was staring into the fire, lost in thought. Sarah was sitting close to him, her eyes darting nervously around the clearing. Minutes passed, and Matt didn't come back. "He's probably just trying to scare us," Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Or he got lost," Lily added, her voice tinged with worrying. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up. "I'll go find him. He couldn't have gone far." Jake and Sarah stood up as well, and together we ventured into the woods in the direction Matt had gone. The trees closed in around us as we moved away from the campfire, the light from our flashlights casting long shadows on the ground. The further we walked, the more uneasy I felt. The air seemed heavier, the darkness deeper. We called out for Matt, but there was no answer, just the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. We reached a small clearing, and that's when we saw it. A deer standing perfectly still at the edge of the trees, staring at us. There was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. Its eyes were too bright, too intelligent, and it didn't move like a normal deer would. It just stood there, watching us. Maybe it's hurt, Lily whispered, taking a step forward. But Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Don't, he said, his voice tight with fear. That's not a deer. Before I could ask what he meant, the deer moved. But it didn't run away like you'd expect. Instead, it started to walk toward us, slowly and deliberately. Its eyes locked on ours. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. There was something terribly wrong with the way it moved, as if it was trying to mimic the way a deer should move, but didn't quite know how. The closer it got, the more my instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. And then, without warning, the deer stood up on its hind legs, its body twisted and contorted, the sound of bones cracking filling the air as it transformed before our eyes. What had been a deer was now something else entirely, something that looked like a man but wasn't. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in sharp claws, and its face was a grotesque blend of human and animal, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. We froze, too terrified to move or even scream. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that rumbled through the ground beneath our feet. It took a step toward us, and that was enough to break the spell. We turned and ran, sprinting back through the woods toward the campfire, our hearts pounding in our chests. When we reached the clearing, we skidded to a halt. Matt was standing there, backlit by the fire, looking as calm as ever. "What's wrong with you guys?" he asked, frowning as we gasped for breath. "Did you see a ghost or something?" We stared at him, too shocked to respond. It was impossible. We'd just seen him or something that looked like him transform into that ... thing in the woods, but here he was, whole and unharmed. Jake was the first to speak. "Matt, where did you go? We've been looking for you." Matt shrugged. "Just took a piss. I was on my way back when I heard you guys shouting." "What's going on?" None of us knew what to say. How could we explain what we'd just seen, what we'd just experienced? It defied logic, defied reason. But the fear was real, the memory of that thing in the wood still fresh in our minds. Lily looked like she was about to cry. "Let's just go," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to be out here anymore." We didn't argue. We quickly packed up our things, dousing the fire and throwing everything into the car. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever was out there in the woods was following us. We didn't talk much on the way back, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we finally got back to town, we dropped everyone off at their homes, and Jake and I drove back to our apartment in silence. That night, I barely slept, haunted by the memory of that creature, that skinwalker, and the question that kept running through my mind. Was Matt really Matt when we found him, or had something else taken his place? We never went back to those woods. In fact, we stopped going on camping trips altogether. The risk was too great, the memories too fresh. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up and think I hear something outside my window, something scratching at the glass, something waiting just beyond the edge of the darkness. And every time I wonder if it's the skinwalker, if it's come back to finish what it started. The decision to get away from it all seemed like the perfect remedy for my stress. I'd been working nonstop for months, and the pressure was starting to take its toll. My therapist suggested a few days in a secluded cabin might help me decompress, so I found a place up in the mountains. It was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, and far from the nearest town, exactly what I thought I needed. The cabin was quaint, just a small one-bedroom place with a tiny kitchen, a fireplace, and a wraparound porch. It was charming in its simplicity, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I stepped inside. The air was fresh, the silence was almost therapeutic, and I immediately knew I had made the right choice. The first night was uneventful. I spent it curled up by the fire with a good book, enjoying the peace and quiet. The second night, however, was different. I'd gone to bed around 10 p.m., exhausted from a long hike earlier in the day. I was fast asleep when something woke me up. A sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It was faint, almost like the creaking of old wood, or the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. But as I lay there, listening in the darkness, I realized it wasn't the cabin settling or the trees outside. It was closer, more deliberate, like someone or something was moving around inside the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, my heart beginning to race as the sound grew louder. Footsteps. Someone was inside the cabin. Panic set in as I slowly reached for my phone, only to remember that I had no signal up here. I cursed under my breath, my mind racing for a plan. The footsteps were getting closer, moving down the hallway towards my bedroom. I could hear the floorboards creak with each step, a slow and steady rhythm that sent chills down my spine. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself with. The only thing I could think of was to hide. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and crawled under it, pressing myself against the wall. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom door. I could see the faint outline of someone standing there just beyond the threshold. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The door creaked open, and I held my breath, praying they wouldn't come inside, but they did. The figures stepped into the room, their silhouette barely visible in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. They were tall, wearing a long coat that brushed the floor as they moved. I could hear their breathing, slow and measured, as they stood there scanning the room. I closed my eyes, willing myself to become invisible, to melt into the shadows under the bed. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and left the room. I waited, counting the seconds, straining to hear the footsteps as they moved down the hallway. The front door creaked open, then slammed shut, and the cabin was silent once more. I stayed under the bed for what must have been another hour, too terrified to move, too afraid that whoever it was might come back. Eventually, I crawled out and grabbed the knife from the kitchen. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I checked every room, every closet, but the intruder was gone. The door was still locked with no signs of forced entry. It was as if they had never been there at all. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. Someone had been in the cabin. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the living room, knife in hand, staring at the door, waiting for them to return. But they didn't. When morning finally came, I packed up my things and left the cabin without looking back. The drive down the mountain was a blur, my mind racing with questions. Who had been in the cabin? How had they gotten in? And, most importantly, why hadn't they done anything to me? I reported the break-in to the rental company, and I got home, but they didn't have any answers. The cabin was old, they said, and sometimes the doors didn't latch properly. Maybe it was just a local who got confused, they suggested. Or maybe I had imagined the whole thing in my sleep-deprived state. But I knew it wasn't a dream, and it wasn't some harmless mistake. Someone had been in that cabin, and they had meant to do something. I could feel it. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who had been there that night. But the memory of those footsteps, that slow and deliberate pace, still haunts me. I can still hear the creak of the floorboards, the soft rustle of that long coat as they move through the cabin. I don't know what they wanted or why they left without a trace. But I do know one thing for sure. I was lucky to get out of there alive. It was a chilly November night in New York City, the kind of night when the wind cuts through your coat and chills you to the bone. I had just finished a late shift at the restaurant where I worked as a line cook, my feet aching from hours of standing. All I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. The streets were mostly empty, the usual bustle of the city subdued by the cold. I waved down a taxi, relieved to see the familiar yellow cab pull up to the curb. The driver, an older man with graying hair and a weary expression, gave me a nod as I climbed into the back seat. "Where to?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "East 79th and 2nd Avenue, I replied, settling into the seat. The interior of the cab was warm, a welcome contrast to the biting cold outside. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, just wanting to zone out until I got home. The cab pulled away from the curb, merging into the sparse traffic dot as we drove. I noticed something odd. The usual hum of the city seemed muffled, distant, as if we were moving through some kind of invisible barrier. The street lights, normally bright and reassuring, cast strange shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. I sat up a little straighter, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. The driver didn't seem to notice anything unusual, his eyes focused on the road ahead. After a few minutes, I glanced at the meter, curious about how much the fare had gone up, but to my surprise, the meter wasn't running. The digital display was dark, no numbers ticking upward as they usually did. "Your meter's not on," I said, leaning forward slightly. The driver didn't respond at first, just kept driving, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. "Don't worry about it," he finally said, his voice low and almost monotone. "This one's on the house." I frowned, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I looked out the window, trying to gauge where we were, but the streets were unfamiliar, the buildings all wrong. It was as if we were in a different city entirely, a place where the normal rules didn't apply. "I think you're going the wrong way," I said, my voice tinged with nervousness. "My place is back that way." The driver didn't respond, just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I reached for my phone, planning to pull up a map or call someone, but the screen was dead, refusing to turn on no matter how many times I pressed the power button. Panic started to set in. I glanced at the driver again, noticing for the first time how pale he looked, almost as if he were sick. His eyes, which had seemed normal at first, now had a strange, glazed-over look, as if he weren't really seeing the road in front of him. "Hey, stop the car!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "I want to get out." The driver ignored me, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. The cab began to pick up speed, the buildings outside blurring as we raced through the city. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sense of dread growing with every passing second. I reached for the door handle, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, and no matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't open. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the glass partition between me and the driver. But he didn't react, didn't even flinch. It was like he couldn't hear me at all, or worse, like he didn't care. The cab continued to speed through the streets, turning down alleys and side roads that I'd never seen before. The city outside the windows had changed completely, the familiar skyline replaced by towering, dark structures that seemed to loom over us, blocking out the sky. I don't know how long we drove like that, but it felt like hours. Time had lost all meaning, the normal rhythms of the city replaced by something sinister and unnatural. The only sound was the roar of the engine and my own frantic breathing. I was trapped, helpless, with no way to escape. Then suddenly the cab screeched to a halt. The abrupt stop threw me forward, nearly slamming my head against the partition. I looked around, disoriented, trying to figure out where we were. The street was deserted, the buildings on either side old and crumbling, their windows dark and empty. There was no sign of life anywhere, just an oppressive silence that made my ears ring. The driver turned around to face me for the first time since we'd started driving. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring back at me where there should have been eyes. His skin was ashen, almost translucent, and his mouth twisted into a ghastly grin. "This is your stop," he said, his voice a low rasp that sent chills down my spine. I recoiled, pressing myself against the back of the seat, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming, or maybe I'd fallen asleep in the back of the cab, and this was some kind of nightmare. But it felt too real, too vivid, and I knew deep down that this was really happening. The door next to me suddenly unlocked with a loud click. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the handle and threw the door open, practically falling out of the cab in my desperation to escape. I stumbled onto the pavement, my legs weak and shaky, and turned to see the cab pulling away, disappearing into the darkness. As it drove off, I could have sworn I heard a faint, eerie laughter echoing down the street. I was alone, standing in the middle of an unfamiliar street with no idea where I was or how I'd gotten there. My phone was still dead, and there were no signs, no landmarks that I recognized. The air was thick with a sense of wrongness, as if the very atmosphere was tainted by something evil. I started walking, my steps unsteady as I tried to find my way out of this nightmare. The buildings loomed over me, their dark windows like empty eyes watching my every move. The street seemed to stretch on forever. No matter how far I walked, the end always just out of reach. I could feel something watching me, following me, though I never saw anyone. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, closing in around me. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw a light up ahead, a faint glow that cut through the darkness. I broke into a run, desperate to reach it, hoping that it was some sign of life, some way out of this hellish place. As I got closer, I realized it was a small diner, the neon sign flickering weakly above the door. I burst through the door, my heart racing, and nearly collapsed onto one of the stools at the counter. The place was empty, save for an older man behind the counter who looked up at me with a bemused expression. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos I'd just escaped. I don't know," I stammered, my voice shaky. "I just ... I was in a cab, and ... and now I'm here. I don't know where I am." The man raised an eyebrow, wiping his hands on a towel. "You're in Brooklyn," he said matter-of-factly, as if that explained everything. "But how ... how did I get here?" I asked, my mind struggling to make sense of it all. He shrugged. "People get lost sometimes. But you're here now, and that's all that matters. How about some coffee?" I nodded numbly, still trying to process what had happened. As he poured me a cup of coffee, I noticed a small TV mounted on the wall behind the counter, the news playing on a loop. The sound was low, but I could just make out the words, "Breaking news. Authorities are investigating the mysterious disappearance of a taxi driver and his passenger, ... last seen in the East Village. The cab was found abandoned with no sign of the driver or the fare ... My blood ran cold as I stared at the screen. The image showed a yellow cab, the same one I had been in, its doors wide open, parked on a deserted street. There was no sign of the driver, no sign of me. I turned to the man behind the counter, my voice trembling. That's the cab I was in." He looked at the screen, then back at me, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" Kid, looks like a lot of cabs in this city, but I knew it was the same one. I could feel it in my bones, a deep, knowing certainty that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than death. I sipped the coffee, my hands shaking, trying to steady my nerves. I didn't know what had happened, how I'd ended up here, or what had become of the driver. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never take another taxi in this city again. The thought of getting into one, of trusting another driver, was too terrifying to contemplate. I finished the coffee and left the diner, the old man watching me as I went. The streets outside were quieter now, the sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I walked, not sure where I was going, but knowing I needed to keep moving, to put as much distance as I could between me and that cursed cab. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something is still following me, watching me from the shadows. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear the faint sound of an engine idling outside my window, or see a flash of yellow out of the corner of my eye. And every time I'm reminded of that night, of the cab that drove me to hell and back. I don't know what it was or why it chose me, but I do know one thing: there are some rides you're better off not taking. The night started like any other on the farm. I'd spent the day tending to the livestock, fixing fences, and making sure everything was in order before the sun dipped below the horizon. Living out in the countryside had its perks: peace, quiet, and a clear view of the stars every night. But it also came with its challenges, especially when it came to the predators that roamed the woods nearby. It wasn't uncommon to hear the howls of coyotes in the distance, their eerie cries echoing through the stillness of the night. But on this particular evening the sounds were different. There was something deeper, more menacing in the air. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on the wind or my imagination, but as the night wore on, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I was inside the farmhouse, sitting by the fire with a hot cup of coffee, when I first heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from just outside the door. My dog, Max, who was lying by the hearth, immediately perked up, his ears standing at attention. He let out a soft whine, his eyes fixed on the front door. I set my coffee down, my heart beginning to race as I strained to hear the sound again. There it was, louder this time, closer. It wasn't a coyote. I knew that much. The growl was too deep, too powerful. Max was on his feet now, growling softly, his fur standing on end. I grabbed the shotgun that I kept by the door, a precaution I had always taken living out here alone. I wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but something didn't feel right. I slowly approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, half expecting to find nothing but the darkness of the night staring back at me. But what I saw instead was something I'll never forget. Standing just beyond the porch, illuminated by the faint light of the full moon, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with a muscular build that seemed almost human. But it wasn't human. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural amber hue. Its face was elongated, like that of a wolf, with a snarling maw full of razor-sharp teeth. Max was barking furiously now, his instincts kicking in as he stood between me and the creature. But the thing didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with those piercing eyes, as if it was studying me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I locked eyes with it, a primal fear coursing through my veins for what felt like an eternity. We just stood there, locked in a silent standoff. I tightened my grip on the shotgun, ready to defend myself if it came any closer, but the creature didn't attack. Instead, it let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air, before slowly backing away into the shadows of the trees. I didn't dare move until I was sure it was gone. When I finally stepped outside, the night was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd seen was real. There was no mistaking the size of those tracks in the dirt, the deep impressions left by something far larger than any animal that should have been out there. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, shotgun in hand, listening for any sign that the creature might return, but the night passed without incident. The following day I searched the area, looking for any more signs of the beast, but the tracks led deep into the woods and eventually disappeared. There was nothing to explain what I had seen, nothing to confirm that it wasn't just a nightmare brought on by the isolation of farm life. But Max knew. He stayed close to me for days afterward, refusing to go outside at night. The memory of that encounter stayed with me, a constant reminder that there are things in this world we don't understand, things that defy explanation. I don't know what that creature was, or why it didn't attack me that night, but I do know that I never felt truly safe on that farm again. I eventually moved away, leaving the farm behind, but the fear, that gnawing sense of dread, never left me. Even now I can still see those glowing eyes in my nightmares, hear the low growl that seemed to echo in the darkest corners of my mind. I've tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself that it was just a wild animal, a trick of the light, anything to make sense of what I saw. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something out there, something that's not supposed to exist, and it's watching, waiting, lurking in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the light.